Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Good afternoon. My name is Glenn Barrows, and welcome to the Wyoming Department of Health, Division of Healthcare Financing, Developmental Disabilities, Section Provider Training Series for Chapter 45 of the Department of Health's Medicaid rules. These rules govern the home and community-based comprehensive and support waivers, and are hereinafter referred to as the DD waivers. Chapter 45, Section 15D states that all persons qualified to provide waiver services shall complete training in specific areas prior to delivering services. Although some provider organizations may choose to develop their own training modules, individuals who complete all of the series training modules and associated training summaries will be in compliance with this specific requirement. Please note that there are provider training requirements established throughout Chapter 45, and it is the responsibility of the providers to ensure they meet all the training requirements prior to delivering waiver services. This module, Module 2, covers Section 4, which addresses the rights of participants receiving services. The purpose of this training is to familiarize providers with the rights and freedoms of DD waiver participants, to establish the importance of honoring those rights, to explain the process and potential risks associated with restricting a participant's rights, and to identify provider requirements related to Section 4. At the end of the module, addressing the rights of participants receiving services, the following topics will have been introduced and explained: the rights of participants receiving services, the steps and considerations involved in restricting a participant's rights, how to use the rights restriction review tool to determine if a rights restriction meets established rules, and provider requirements and responsibilities associated with implementing rights restrictions. Please note that for the purpose of these trainings, providers include provider staff and case managers unless there is a specific need to make a distinction. Home and community-based waiver services are based on the tenet that people have the freedom to make choices that impact their lives. Whether the choices are related to big decisions such as who provides their services, where they live, or what they want for their future, or small decisions such as with whom to spend time, what and when they eat, how they spend their day, having choice is paramount to human dignity. Facilitating individual choice is a crucial part of being a waiver provider. Human rights are rights inherent to all human beings, regardless of race, sex, nationality, ethnicity, language, religion, or any other status. Human rights include the right to life, liberty, freedom from slavery and torture, freedom from opinion and expression, the right to work and education, and many more. Everyone is entitled to these rights without discrimination. As established in Chapter 45, Section 4A, each participant receiving services has the same legal rights and responsibilities guaranteed to all other U.S. citizens under the United States and Wyoming constitutions and federal and state laws. In addition to basic human rights, participants of Comprehensive and Support Waiver, DD Waiver, services have specific rights established in Section 4C. These sections shall not be denied or limited except to address a health or safety need, and the rights include the right to privacy, the right to freedom from restraint, the right to privacy in their sleeping or living quarters, the right to sleeping and living quarters that have entrance doors that can be locked by the participant with only the participant and appropriate staff having keys to the doors, the right to choose with whom and where they live, freedom to furnish and decorate their sleeping or living quarters within the lease or other agreement, freedom and support to control their own schedules and activities, the right to privacy, the right to freedom from restraint, the right to privacy in their sleeping or living quarters, the right to sleeping and living quarters that have entrance doors that can be locked by the participant, with only the participant and appropriate staff having keys to doors, the right to choose with whom and where they live, freedom to furnish and decorate their sleeping quarters within a lease or other agreement, freedom and support to control their own schedules and activities. And I believe I just read that twice, and I apologize. Home and community-based waiver services are voluntary. Participants have the right to refuse these services even for an hour or a day. As an example, the participant can choose to stay home rather than attending daytime services in another setting. Let's face it, sometimes we all need a break from routine and just to relax. While participants have the right to refuse services, it is still important for the provider to encourage participation. A participant choosing to stay home and just relax for a day is understandable. However, unless health-related, if this happens consistently, then there is an indication that the services the participant is receiving may not be meeting their needs. Providers should talk to the participants and work to understand why the participant is not engaged in their services. If necessary, request a team meeting so the team can work with the participant to identify what isn't working and get input as to what needs to change so the participant is ready and willing to participate. In the event that a participant chooses to refuse services, the provider cannot charge the participant a monetary fee or impose a sort of disciplinary action. Providers are required to develop and implement a policy that ensures this right. Policies will be discussed later in this module. The requirements for imposing restrictions on a participant's rights will be discussed later in this module. While some participants' rights can be restricted in limited situations, there are some rights that a provider cannot restrict under any circumstance during the course of providing waiver services, and these rights include treating participants with dignity and respect is critical to providing DD waiver services. This means that you honor the participant's preferences, interests, and goals, facilitate opportunities for participants to make their own choices, encourage participants to express their wishes and desires and needs, and design the services you provide to meet the participant's individual needs. Remember, what works for one person may not work for another. As established in Section 4F, providers cannot request or require participants to waive or limit their rights as a condition of receiving services. Providers may choose to not serve an applicant or provide notice that they will no longer serve a participant, this process of which is described in detail in Chapter 45, Section 22, but they may not offer their services only on the condition that the participant waive any of their rights. Participants and legally authorized representatives are informed of their rights during the application process and are reminded of those rights at least once every 6 months. They should know their rights and should be exercising those rights while receiving services. Providers shall not intimidate, threaten, coerce, discriminate against, or take retaliatory actions against an individual who exercises their rights. Retaliatory actions or acts are also prohibited by any provider type if the participant, legally authorized representative, case manager, or provider or other plan of care team member files a complaint or incident or is involved in an investigation resulting from a complaint or incident report. When discussing rights, it's important to note that there are some differences between adults and children. Parents or another court-appointed guardian typically exercise control of the rights of children. For requirements related to restrictions imposed on children, please reference the IPC guide. According to the Wyoming statute, people 18 years of age or older are considered adults. Even if a participant has a legally authorized representative, any right that is restricted must meet the requirements outlined in Chapter 45, Section 4, and must be documented in the participant's IPC. We will discuss this later in the training, but it's important for providers, case managers, and legally authorized representatives to understand that the rights of the participant, who is an adult, cannot be restricted just because the legally authorized representative feels that it's necessary. A core value driving the DD waivers is participant choice. Providers are tasked with supporting individuals in making choices in their lives, and often a legally authorized representative, provider, or case manager may believe they know what is best for the participant, or that the participant will make a bad choice if given the freedoms required by the home and community-based settings rule. Team members must remember that all individuals, including people who receive waiver services, have the right to make choices, even if those choices may result in poor outcomes. People learn by making mistakes. Providers and other members of the Planet Care team must maximize a person's ability to make choices while minimizing the risk of endangering the person or others. Although we want to promote safety for participants, we want to be sure to value safety while supporting the participant's right to dignity of risk. In limited circumstances, a participant's rights may be restricted if a plan of care team determines that a restriction on a participant's rights is necessary. The reason for the restriction must be thoroughly documented in the IPC and meet the federal requirements for home and community-based services. Additionally, the legal document or medical orders that allows this person other than the participant to authorize a restriction must be uploaded into the electronic Medicaid waiver system, or EMWS. Legal documents may include guardianship papers or the assignment of a representative payee by the Social Security Administration. Restricting a participant's basic human rights should never be taken lightly and should never be the only response to a challenging situation. The team needs to identify ways to address the concern that don't include limiting individual rights. Given that the waiver is intended to help people develop, learn, and keep skills, this might be an opportunity for participants and teams to identify meaningful goals and objectives. There must be a specific reason for imposing a rights restriction, and that reason can never be for the convenience of the provider or the legally authorized representative, or just because the legally authorized representative feels it would be in the best interest of the participant. Think for a minute how you would respond if you couldn't make basic decisions such as what you could eat and when. Are you a coffee drinker? Do you like to settle down with a glass of wine after work? Are you all for a nightly dip into chocolate ice cream container? Imagine that you have just been told that you can't indulge in any of those pleasures any longer. Imagine being told that you have to make your bed every morning. How would you react? When a person's rights are restricted, it takes away from the person's control over their own life. When people don't have control, people may become frustrated and seek to find control in other ways. This control may be demonstrated through an increase in outbursts, aggression, or other behavior that will challenge a provider. If someone told me I couldn't have coffee or wine, I'm certain that my response would be less than optimal. Chapter 45, Section 4C clearly defines that a participant's rights shall not be defined or denied or limited except for the purpose of an identified health and safety need. If this need exists, it should be demonstrated throughout the participant's IPC, not just listed as a rights restriction. As an example, adults have the right to access legal sexually explicit materials. This right cannot be restricted unless there is a written court order or written order from a licensed medical or behavioral practitioner based on verifiable history of illegal sexual activity or perceived intent of the participant to commit a crime of a sexual nature. Prohibiting access to such materials simply based on a moral judgment by others is not allowed. The first key to identifying a need for potential rights restriction is for the plan of care team to be on the same page and really understand the needs and risks of the participant. It is important for the team to work collaboratively to develop the best plan for the participant. Before imposing a rights restriction, be sure to ask questions. Challenge the team to look at all the supports that are available. Look for other ways to address the health and safety need that don't require rights restriction. If the team finds a strategy that works, be sure to document this information in the IPC. Be sure to identify the safety need that the team is working to mitigate. Oftentimes, what might at first seem like a safety need is really more of a personal preference of a legally authorized representative or provider. Is being overweight a safety concern as defined by a physician, or is it a fact that makes the legally authorized representative unhappy? Anytime the potential of a rights restriction is discussed, the team must consider the negative impact that it may have on the participant and must determine if these negative issues have less of an impact on the participant than the risk the rights restriction is supposed to mitigate. An example situation in which a safety concern could be utilized as the basis for a rights restriction is when a person has a medical diagnosis such as polydipsia. Polydipsia is a condition in which an individual experiences an intense thirst or excessive drinking, which, if not addressed appropriately, may lead to undesired or even deadly health consequences. If an individual does not have the ability to appropriately self-regulate the amount of their fluid intake, a restriction of the right to freely access and drink fluids may be appropriate. Even though appropriate, to implement such a rights restriction would require an order from a licensed medical or psychiatric practitioner and adherence to the rights restriction criteria outlined in this section. Chapter 45, Section 4H(I) establishes specific criteria that must be met before a restriction on a participant's rights can be imposed. The team must discuss these items and the case manager must include them in the participant's IPC. These criteria include identification of the specific and individualized assessed need, documentation of the positive interventions and supports used prior to any modification to the IPC, documentation of less intrusive methods of meeting the need that have been tried but did not work, a clear description of the condition that is directly proportionate to the specific assessed need, a system of regular data collection and review to measure the ongoing effectiveness of the modification, establish time limits for periodic reviews not to exceed 6 months to determine if the modification is still necessary or can be terminated. Informed consent of the individual, an assurance that the interventions and supports will cause no harm to the individual. Chapter 45, Section 4H II also requires that the IPC address how the team will work to restore any right that has been limited or denied. Any person who delivers services to a participant must understand each participant's rights as well as the specific limitations of those rights. The IPC must include detail on how the provider will impose the restriction and how the dignity of the participant will be maintained. Providers must ensure that this information is adequately communicated to all staff members. Individuals involved in the day-to-day work must have the right information. Staff training needs to be a recurring agenda item that cannot just happen once. The needs of participants change on a regular basis, and so should the training and support that is offered to staff. Positive support and an atmosphere of improvement starts at the top. Staff members can only continue to grow if there is an expectation for them to do so. Participants need to understand how and why their rights are restricted, but more importantly, they need to understand what they need to do and the skills they need to demonstrate in order to have their rights reinstated. Although a participant's rights may be restricted in some way, it is not an all-or-nothing proposition. A person's right to eat what they want, when they want, may be restricted based on orders from a licensed medical professional. However, that participant can still have some control over what and when they eat. The team should work together to find creative ways to offer that person as much control as possible in their own life. What happens if things don't work? What happens if they improve? Either way, you want to make sure to document how you see health, behaviors, and decision-making change or stay the same. Be sure the IPC includes the strategies that haven't worked as well as those that have. These are elements that perhaps only you as the provider see on a daily basis. The team may not see these elements until it comes time to review the plan or if a crisis occurs. You need to ensure that you are documenting progress and are keeping the team informed. Often, division staff members only see a plan for restoring rights documented as the team will review. This type of plan depends 100% on you as the provider documenting progress and keeping the team informed. If a participant's rights have been restricted, they should have a concrete goal that addresses skills or behaviors they need to master in order to have that right restored. The restriction should not take the place of skill building for the participant, but should instead offer a roadmap for achieving more independence. Rights restrictions must be reviewed at least every 6 months. During these reviews, the plan of care team should discuss ways in which the restriction can be relaxed, even if it can't be completely removed. In rare circumstances, a restriction on the participant's right to be free from restraint can be imposed. Section 4D establishes that before this type of rights restriction can be imposed, a court, participant, or participant's legally authorized representative must authorize the restriction in writing. In addition to the written authorization, this type of rights restriction must be accompanied by letters from both a licensed medical professional and a licensed behavioral professional detailing the medical and psychological contraindications that may be contraindications that may be associated with the restraint. The division is not requesting that teams seek permission from licensed professionals. If a restraint is part of the participant's IPC, it is important for the team, and especially the provider that may be performing the restraint, to to understand the medical and psychological concerns that are present. Concerns such as brittle bones or respiratory challenges may be included in the letter from the medical professional. Past trauma or aversion to touch may be outlined in a letter from the behavioral professional. If there aren't any concerns, it should be noted in the letter as well. If a participant has restraint written into their plan of care, they are required to be under the care of a medical and behavioral professional. A restraint should be used as a last resort and only applied if other less restrictive interventions have been tried and failed. Less restrictive interventions must be written into the IPC, so all team members are aware of strategies that can be used to de-escalate situations and perhaps avoid the need for restraint. These less restrictive interventions are usually located in the Positive Behavior Support Plan, which is a component of the IPC. In addition to this section, Chapter 45, Section 18 establish rules specific to the use of chemical, mechanical, and physical restraints. If a rights restriction doesn't meet the requirements outlined in Section 4, the division can reject the rights restriction. It is important to understand that if a rights restriction is rejected, this means that the rights restriction cannot be imposed by any DD waiver provider. The division will not allow an unauthorized rights restriction based simply on the desire of a legally authorized representative or provider. As an example, if a provider desires to have designated alone time with his family in the evening, he cannot formally or informally impose a bedroom curfew or restrict client access of normally accessible portions of the home for that time period, as this would simply be based on provider desire or convenience and not meet the criteria for a legally imposed rights restriction. Another example is if a legally authorized representative feels that a participant makes unsafe dating choices. The legally authorized representative requests that the provider prohibit the participant from spending time with members of the opposite sex and sets a list of pre-approved visitors that the participant is authorized to visit. Section 4C9 establishes participant freedom to have visitors of their choosing at any time and associate with people of their choosing. A legally authorized representative's concern that a participant may make unsafe dating choices does not constitute a health and safety risk, so this restriction would not be allowed. Occasionally, providers or provider staff members impose limitations on the rights of participants without realizing it. The division regularly sees the following circumstances when conducting site visits. When you're finished vacuuming, then you can go to the movies. You can't have dessert until you finish your dinner. It's 10 o'clock, time to turn off your TV. You don't need another soda, you've already had one today. Sometimes these inadvertent rights restrictions are imposed because of provider or staff member preferences and beliefs. For example, Sally, the staff member who works with Jill and her roommates, read an article about the negative effects that sugar and grain have on a person's immune system. Jill has psoriasis, which is an autoimmune disease. Sally decides Jill should stop eating frosted mini wheats, which is Jill's favorite breakfast, because of the high grain and sugar content. Since Sally helps Jill and her roommates with her grocery shopping, Sally makes sure the frosted mini wheats don't make it into the grocery cart. When Jill doesn't have her favorite cereal, Sally suggests that she have eggs and plain yogurt for breakfast. Sally thought she helped Jill by making a great choice, but what Sally did was restrict Jill's right to eat what she wanted for breakfast. Remember that when providing services to adults, these types of rules are not allowed unless there is a rights restriction noted in the plan of care. Providers can encourage participants to make what most would consider to be good choices, but they cannot put arbitrary limitations on choices that adults without disabilities can make, even if the choice is viewed as a bad choice or creates an inconvenient situation for the provider. Because the number of requirements that are associated with imposing a restriction on a participant's right, the division has developed the Rights Restriction Review Tool, which can be found on the Forms and Document Library page of the division website. Under the Reference Tools section, the tool was designed to guide the participant support specialist in reviewing rights restrictions and guide the case manager in writing the rights restriction. However, providers of all waiver services are encouraged to use the tool to determine if a restriction meets established criteria. The division has developed a specific training to guide case managers through the rights restriction review tool. This training can be found on the training page of the division website under the case manager training section. The rights restriction review tool walks the user through the criteria that must be met in order to impose a rights restriction. This criteria include assurance that guardianship papers, letter from medical professionals, or other required documentation is present. Assurance that the IPC addresses how the team will monitor the restriction and specific responsibilities the provider has in imposing the rights restriction. Previous strategies and less restrictive interventions that have been tried in order to lessen the rights restriction but have failed. Assurance that the restriction is proportionate to the risk that is being mitigated. Demonstration that data is being collected and regular reviews are being conducted to determine if the restriction is still appropriate. Demonstration that the participant and legally authorized representative have been fully informed on why and how a rights restriction will be imposed. Assurance that the rights restriction will not cause harm to the participant, and a detailed plan on how the team will work with the participant to restore the right or lessen the restriction over time. Implementation of the restriction of a participant's rights may be reviewed as a part of the provider certification renewal or as a result of a complaint or incident report. Case managers must ensure that the rights restriction meets the requirements established in rule. Providers must ensure that they are following the restriction that has been included in the participant's IPC and accepted by the plan of care team. If the division identifies deficiencies in how the rights restriction is explained in the IPC or in how the provider is imposing the restriction, follow-up including resubmitting the IPC, provider corrective action, or eliminating the rights restriction may be required. Chapter 45, Section 4E establishes specific policies and procedures that DD waiver providers must implement. Waiver provider policies and procedures must address the participant's opportunity to maximize their right and responsibilities, the participant's right to refuse services without being disciplined or charged a fee for refusing services, how and when the people will be informed of the participant's rights and responsibilities, how the provider will support participants in exercising their rights, that rights will not be treated as privileges or something that must be earned, and prohibition of retaliatory practices. These policies and procedures must be given to participants, legally authorized representatives when the participant enters services and at least annually thereafter, and any time a significant change occurs. The The policies and procedures must be presented in a manner that is easily understood, given verbally, in writing, or in other modes of communication that may be necessary for understanding, and in the native language of the participant or legally authorized representative. The division has developed general policy templates which can be found on the Forms and Document Library page of the division website. Under the Certification Forms tab, providers may use the example policies as a starting point to develop policies that are specific to their circumstances. Providers are obligated to follow the policies that they adopt. Please note that there are policy and procedures requirements established throughout Chapter 45, and it is the responsibility of providers to ensure that they develop and implement all required policies and procedures. Many of these requirements will be addressed in other provider training series modules, but it is ultimately up to the provider to ensure these requirements are met. Providers are responsible for imposing rights restrictions, and this is not a responsibility that should be taken lightly. Providers need to ask questions. Why is this right being restricted? Is this for the good of the participant? Has the proper authorization been obtained? What can I do to ensure this person has as much control over their own life as possible? Are there other strategies that the team can try rather than restricting this person's right? You should be working with a participant to teach them skills, impart knowledge, and encourage behavior that is going to help them gain full restoration of their rights over time. Provider's job should not be to limit a participant's life, but to help the participant live the fullest life they can. The more rights the participant can exercise, the higher their quality of life will be. If you have concerns, it is your responsibility to voice them. You are part of the team that is charged with advocating for the participant, and it is your right to bring any concerns or solutions to the team for discussion. Before you complete this training, we'd like to review some of the key takeaways. 1, human rights ensure basic equality and humanity. They protect vulnerable populations from abuse and encourage people to exercise their freedom of speech and religion. They allow people to love whom they choose and give people access to education. The participants of DD Waiver services can enjoy and exercise their rights, and providers of waiver services are obligated to facilitate opportunities for them to do so. 2, there are circumstances in which participants' rights can be limited, but rights restrictions should be imposed only as a last resort. There may be other ways to address health or safety needs without going straight to a rights restriction. If a rights restriction is imposed, the participant should be afforded every opportunity to be involved and have as much control as possible. 3, if a participant's rights are restricted, the plan of care team must discuss the points outlined in slide 16, and the case manager must address this information in the IPC. The Rights Restriction Review tool is available to help case managers and plan of care teams ensure that rights restrictions meet standards outlined in rule. Number 4, providers are obligated to ask questions, voice concerns, and to work to lessen restrictions over time. The provider's job should not be to limit a participant's life, but to help the participant live the fullest life that they can. The more rights the participant can exercise, the better their life will be. And 5, if a rights restriction is not listed in the IPC, providers cannot restrict the right. This ends the training on rights of participants receiving DD waiver services that has been conducted by the Division of Healthcare Financing, Developmental Disability Section. If you have questions related to the information in this training, please contact your provider or participant support specialist. Contact information can be found on clicking on the link provided in the slide. Please be sure to complete a summary of this training so that you can demonstrate that you have received training on the rights of participants receiving services.